Welcome back to a new episode of Podcasts on the Brink. Indiana men's basketball narrowly missed the NCAA tournament. For those of you that watched the selection show, the Hoosiers were the second team out of the tournament, but the Indiana women are back in the NCAA tournament once again, headed to Columbia, South Carolina to take on Utah Friday afternoon. That game will tip 1:30 p.m. Eastern time. And we've got Austin Render of the IU Radio Network, the voice of the IU women's basketball program, back on Podcast on the Brink this week. Before we get to Austin, wanted to take a quick moment, remind you that Podcast on the Brink is brought to you by our friends at Visit Bloomington. Visit Bloomington is a proud partner of Podcast on the Brink and Indiana University Athletics. March Madness has officially kicked off and spring is about to begin. Catch the NCAA men's and women's tournaments while enjoying some award-winning wings at Buffalo's, go paddleboarding on Lake Lemon, or experience one of the many spring festivals in Bloomington, like the Cosmic Songwriter Festival and Grand Falloon. Order your free visitor guide and plan your spring getaway at visitbloomington.com. Sounds like a lot going on in Bloomington this spring, but right now, the focus of this particular podcast on the Brink is IU women's basketball, as I mentioned at the top. Hoosiers headed to Columbia, South Carolina. Austin, curious your thoughts just on this matchup initially when you look at it. An 8-9 game, these are always tricky to pick when you're filling out a bracket. These teams look pretty evenly matched. We were talking a little bit before. You mentioned both like to shoot the three-pointer a lot. And they've had some common opponents over the course of the season. I believe Utah actually lost at Northwestern early in the season. Not a great loss on the resume, but I know they have some firepower when it comes to scoring. Should be a fun game to watch if you like offense.
I think so, Alex. I think it's going to be a 3-point contest. I'm sure both coaches are currently trying to game plan how they take that away from the other one. But I mean, their coach after the selection show, Gavin Peterson, said, we're looking forward to showcasing our ability to let the three-pointer fly, and they will shoot it. They shoot it at you think Indiana shoots it at a high clip. Utah shoots it at a higher clip. Indiana takes it at about a 34% rate offensively. This Utah team shoots the three even more. They shoot it at 40% of their offensive possessions. It's kind of crazy how often they take three-pointers. It's 12th most in the country, that 40% three-point rate. They get 39% of their points coming from the three-point line. Again, that's top 15 in the country. So we've thought all year that that's kind of Indiana's recipe for success. It's absolutely Utah's. So it's a really fascinating matchup of two teams who I think will probably operate fairly similarly in the way they want to win, but it's going to be a completely different way in the way they want to get to those three-point line. I think two different teams will play two different styles here to try and create those three-point shots.
In terms of preparation for a team like this, what goes into that from an IU perspective with the common opponents? Is it something where maybe they reach out to some of these teams that maybe they've played and talked to, try to get some hints? I know Terry Moore mentioned that possibility on Sunday night when she did her Zoom with the media, mentioned maybe talking to Northwestern. There's a common opponent there. But in terms of the short prep, there's not a lot of time. You know, the Big Ten is so well scouted and all these teams know each other so well. Given the short window, I think how these two respective teams prepare and get familiar with one another and are able to digest the scouting report and carry out a game plan is going to really play a pretty big factor on how this game turns out.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I like Terry Moran with a little bit of time here this week to scout. I think that's an advantage for Indiana. But you mentioned the common opponents. They both have played Baylor. That's obviously a conference opponent now for Utah. Baylor beat Utah. Indiana beat Baylor down in the Bahamas. I wouldn't say there's going to be much sharing of notes there cross-conference, but I wouldn't be shocked if Coach Moran got on the phone and dialed up Joe McEwen out at Northwestern and asked him how they were able to knock off Utah. That was probably Northwestern's biggest win, actually, definitely their biggest win of the season, coming back in November. It was, I believe, their first win of the year. So that was kind of one that scratched your head, because it wasn't long after that, down in a tournament on November 30th, that Utah beat Notre Dame. So it was very weird to juxtapose those. Like, they went to Northwestern and lost, but beat a team at that time was top five. Certainly, I can't believe they're a 3 seed, Notre Dame, but certainly a team that's capable of being top 5 or 6 in the country. So Utah has that feather in their cap, but also a strange loss to Utah. So teams evolve. I mean, if you ask Butler or Harvard's coaches what they learned about beating Indiana in November, it probably wouldn't do you a whole lot of good this week. Indiana plays a lot differently. They have adapted their offensive style since that opening week or two, and I would imagine Utah is a very similar way with the new coach and Gavin Peterson. So I expect them to look a lot different than maybe Joe McEwen and Northwestern saw them, but hey, worth dialing him up and seeing if he's got any advice.
Yeah, the other thing worth pointing out, I think, on that game, it was so early in the season. I believe at that point, Utah, Lynn Roberts was still the coach, because I believe she started the season the first 3 or 4 games before leaving for the Los Angeles Sparks of the WNBA. So kind of an interesting situation there with Utah. You don't often see a coach begin a season and then leave in season, and they've, to their credit, they've been able to. Gavin Peterson's been able to, I know he was there before and was the associate head coach, and it was kind of a natural fit for him to take over. But just an interesting circumstance there with them starting a season with one coach, and then obviously being able to find their way into the tournament after the coaching change. With Indiana, you mentioned just how they've changed over the course of the season. Obviously, we've talked a couple of times this season on Podcast on the Brink. I know we had you on the preseason, we had you on a couple months ago, but what are the biggest things that have changed for this Indiana team since the beginning of the season, where they struggled, obviously had some really tough losses? You mentioned the Butler game as one of those, as a prime example, but I'm curious just how you've seen this team evolve and change as the season has moved along, and maybe how they're better now than they were early on.
Well, they had to kind of go through an identity change, and I think those first few games was kind of the identity crisis for Indiana of, okay, who are we? And when you lose somebody as good as Mackenzie Holmes, somebody who you've had in your program for so long that you've just kind of gotten used to running this 4 out, 1 in, let's dump into the post, play inside out. And Indiana tried to do that early in the season with Meister and Striplin, and it's just not really their games. And Indiana figured that out as they went, that, hey, we still have a lot of those shooters that led the country in three-point shooting last year. So they have really leaned into that. And one of the things they do that Lindsey Gottlieb pointed out after the Big Ten tournament game is they do a really good job of bringing your bigs out of the paint, because you do, to some extent, have to respect the jump shot of Striplin and Meister. Specifically, Striplin, she's hit a lot of those elbow free throw line jumpers, and she can make a top of the key 3-pointer. So when she comes out to set that high ball screen, typically the 5 has to follow her. And you can get into some mismatches there. You can get some back cuts to the basket now that the rim protector is out of the paint. And that was causing USC a ton of issues, especially in the first half of that tournament game. Indiana was having a lot of luck getting to the basket because they were able to bring Iriafem and Akunwafu out of the paint. They had to respect Striplin's ability to roll and hit the jumper, and it puts them in a very difficult position defensively. That's one of the things Indiana's really utilized this year, is that high pick and roll. And Garrett Zone runs it really well with Striplin. Occasionally she'll throw it when she's anticipating it being open and it's not. But for the most part, she runs it very well. And she's such a difficult person to guard off of that, because if you sag off of her at all, she will take that shot. If you're on her, she can usually be tall enough to throw it around you or over you. And she does a really good job with that. So they've adapted the offense to say, look, we still want to have an inside presence, but I think they've leaned into the fact that the guard play is their strength. They have spread the floor a little bit better with Striplin in the starting lineup now. And I think recently the play of Shea Chesky unlocks a lot for this offense. She's played so much better here over the last about month of the season. She's shooting almost 50% from 3 over that time, and she's making good decisions with the basketball. They've kind of taken her off the ball a little bit more, early in the season, they had the Lexi Bargesser injury, and so Shea was having to play a lot more point guard than she's used to. Her turnovers were up, and they've put Lexi in that position more now as the season's gone on. Let Shea play off the ball, and I think that's been a good thing overall.
In terms of the players maybe feeling more comfortable in their roles as the season has gone along, how big of a factor has that been? Because early in the season, it kind of felt like you'd watch some games and it was almost like somebody was waiting for somebody else to step up and make a play, and that player, in the past would have been Grace Berger or Mackenzie Holmes or Sarah Scalia last year, and this year that wasn't always there early on, and I can remember some of the early season press conferences where Terry Morin was, kind of searching for that in terms of finding someone that wanted to step up and make a play. And it seems like as the season has gone along, there have been different circumstances where a different player will step up on a given night, and it seems like that's been a pretty big area of growth. You watch these games up close as much as anybody. How have you maybe seen that progress as the year goes along, and who are maybe two or three players that have maybe embraced the idea of, hey, it might be my night tonight, and I got to go make a play and try to carry my team.
Well, you're right. Early in the season, everybody was kind of that Spider-Man meme where everybody's looking at each other like, okay, are you going to go do it? And it was on display late in both the Harvard and Butler games when Indiana needed baskets and nobody could really create. It still pops up from time to time as issues with the offense. They still have those 3-4 minute scoring droughts where it looks a little bit stagnant. There's still games like Minnesota, Maryland, where they just don't really have it. But when they do, it's Shea Chesky getting to the bucket. In the Big Ten tournament, she was phenomenal off the dribble, getting to her pull-up game, getting to that block where she would pivot around, do a step through, has a lot of moves in her game, and she's really unlocked that here recently. I've seen Sydney Parrish become really aggressive here over the last 3 or 4 games. She's not the fastest person in the world, but she's been really putting her head down and driving. And when you shoot the ball as well as she does, it does give you that opportunity to shot fake and put the ball on the deck. She's been more aggressive. And again, when I've said this all year, when Chloe Moore McNeil is playing downhill with the intent of getting to the bucket and either getting fouled or getting 2 points, that's when Indiana's at its best. Too often this year, Indiana's point guards will take it down the lane and stop 5 or 6 feet out, pivot around, and throw it back out. When Chloe is going downhill with intent to get to the free throw line, she had 10 free throws against USC in that Big Ten tournament game. That's, again, another element that makes Indiana so much better offensively. It's not Garzon's game to put it on the deck and create. She's gotten better at it this year, but it's still not really her game. She's truly a catch and shoot 3-pointer. Now, she showed off against USC, a couple of nice moves to get some 3-point shots, but I think early in the season, there was a lot of, okay, she's our best player. She's going to start making things happen. And I think Indiana has kind of said, look, it's not Yarden's game. Let's let other people do that and create for Yarden. And that's allowed her to become this 40+% 3-point shooter that's lethal.
Now, there have been some games where Garzon, it seems like from an athletic standpoint, she's maybe a little bit overmatched. I'm curious, when you look at this Utah matchup, is that something that she could have potential problems with, or is this a team that maybe in terms of the style of play and how they're wanting to play, it sets up as a pretty good matchup for her? You mentioned their tendency to like to shoot a bunch of threes, but I'm just curious, from an athletic standpoint, are they going to be pressuring her heavily, or is it going to be a game where she's able to likely be able to get some shots off from the perimeter?
I'll be honest, I haven't watched a ton of film yet of Utah, but just looking at the statistics of it, I mean, this is not an overly tall Utah team. They have no guard listed on their roster that's over 6 foot. That's where the ultimate advantage is for Yarden, because she is 6'3". She is long. She is lanky. She can shoot. She has such a quick release that she can get the ball up and over almost anybody. The defensive side of the floor is the issue when you play these smaller guards, though. Can Yarden get down in a stance and defend some of the quicker players on Utah? I do know they're going to try and do a lot of dribble handoffs at the top of the key, which has given Indiana some fits this year. If you think back to the Illinois game, You think back to the Maryland game. There's been a couple other times this year. Michigan did a lot of that. A lot of dribble handoffs, and Indiana has had issues defending that this year, whether it's been communication, whether it's been athleticism. So that's certainly something I would imagine they are hammering home in practice this week, is trying to defend those dribble handoffs. But again, if you've got this Utah team that's not all that tall, they're going to match up with you 4 guards to 4 guards. You can do a lot of switching, and that's my guess, is that they will do a lot of switching in those dribble handoffs. It's just a question of whether or not Utah will get Strickland involved in those, which I would imagine they will try to do. But without watching a ton of Utah tape, to be honest, when I saw the draw, I was like, okay, Utah's a blind spot for me. I haven't watched a lot of Utah this year. But I do think that there are times where Yarden is a little bit out of place defensively because of the athleticism. I think that was the Illinois game when she got benched for the 4th quarter of that game. Illinois has been a thorn in Indiana's side ever since Shauna Green got there. I don't expect her to get benched for the 4th quarter of this game. I think we're going to be okay there. But I think the big thing for Yarden is that she can't get frustrated with a specific, let's say she gets an offensive foul or she gets a tic-tac reach in. She can't let one foul become a quick second foul. And at times that she's been in foul trouble a lot this year. Indiana needs her on the floor. So she's got to stay mentally focused that, hey, maybe she gets driven by one time in the Utah offense, but that's don't be reaching, don't committing silly fouls because they need her on the floor.
Obviously, Indiana would have liked to gone into this tournament with a win, but given the circumstances of what they were going up against in the Big Ten this season, they have to still feel pretty good about the way they played in the Big Ten tournament, taking USC all the way to the wire, playing really well against the Trojans. Is that a a performance that can actually give them a little boost of confidence? The fact that they went on a neutral court and played a top 2 or 3 team in the country to I think it was a 5-point game.
Yep.
That's something I think you can build on, even though coaches are never into the idea of losing as a good thing, but taking them wire to wire has to give Indiana some confidence going into the NCAA tournament play.
No doubt. I mean, coaches can say they don't want to lose, and I get that. But you and I can sit on here and say that to me was as good as a win. Indiana played well enough to win that game. There's only so much you can do when Juju Watkins and Kiki Iriafen both get double doubles, both combined for like 55 points. That you tip your cap to 2 WNBA future stars, and you say, great job. Like that's all you can do. In years past, Indiana could survive a Caitlin Clark 35-point game because they had somebody in Mackenzie Holmes that was kind of going toe-to-toe. And they almost did that because they had Yarden going toe-to-toe there for a while with Juju Watkins. But the Iriafen thing was very difficult to defend. She was hitting a lot of jumpers. But I think there's no doubt it's almost only positives that can come away from that game. I mean, the ultimate positive would have been pulling it off and saying, look at what we can do. But I still think it's hey, if we do end up with South Carolina on Sunday afternoon, they've played USC tight twice. They've beaten Ohio State. They played UCLA, all things considered, pretty tough. And I know they won another crack at UCLA, didn't get into the tournament, but I do think that there are things to draw on. The big thing for this team all season long has been consistency. We see it for a game or two where, okay, this is a really good basketball team. And then they'll play against Maryland and Michigan State and turn the ball over 20 times each game, not make any threes. And you're just like, what was that? Since the start of February, they've gone 2 wins, 2 losses, 2 wins, 2 losses, 2 wins, 2 losses, basically for the last month and a half of the season. So can they find a way to be a little bit more consistent here and bring that play to Columbia? I actually think Indiana is one of the teams that probably, and I think they'll be fine. But had you played this tournament starting last Friday instead of this Friday, I think Indiana would have benefited from that. They were playing well in Indianapolis. They had some momentum. And so to sit here now and wait 2 weeks to play again, I think can be a slight disadvantage for Indiana as opposed to Utah, who had a really bad loss in the Big 12 tournament to a bad Texas Tech team, and they get 2 weeks now to reset. Again, Terry Morin's a great coach. They have spent these 2 weeks wisely. I'm not worried about it. But when you say, is there a team that could have benefited from less time off? I think Indiana could have, because they played maybe their best game of the season against Oregon, and then maybe their second best game against USC. Certainly offensively, they played great. So I think if they can kind of take that and carry it with them, they're going to be really dangerous. And I would imagine Dawn Staley, I know she's fired up about not being the number 1 overall seed. I can't imagine she was too excited about seeing Indiana in her pod after the way the Hoosiers battled them last year. So I think if Indiana takes that with them, that's the big question. Can they take it with them? But if they do, they're going to be tough to beat.
Just in terms of the layoff, I mean, that's a thing every year in the women's
Yep.
tournament, just based on the timing. How have you seen that impact Indiana in previous years? Is it something that where they've maybe come out slow in some games based on the
Well,
layoff, or
it's been hard to know the last 2 years because it's Mackenzie's been hurt. So you
right?
think about 2 years ago, she gets hurt in the Big Ten championship or the Big Ten tournament semifinal, and doesn't even end up playing in the first round of the NCAA tournament. None of us knew that was going to happen until the day of. And so that it was hard to kind of assess how that break did for them because your best player was out. And then the break was crucial last year because Mackenzie was hurt again, and it gave her 2 weeks. She wasn't as hurt that year as she was the year before. So she was able to take those 2 weeks to rest and then was ready to go for that run that the Hoosiers made to the Sweet 16. So there's certainly times where it can be very helpful when you're battling those injuries like Indiana has been the past couple of years. But I think like 2-3 years ago when Indiana had that crazy win against Princeton at home before they went to go play UConn, that was a year that they did not show any rust in that first game. I think they played Charlotte and just ran them out of the building. But this will be different because this is the first time that Indiana has gone on the road for an NCAA tournament game since the bubble COVID year in 2021. And it'll be the first time if they beat Utah that they'll play a team on their home floor since 2019 when they played against Oregon. So this will be different. But I think with the relative health that this team has been able to maintain throughout the season, the break was probably more used for a resting period for a lot of these starters that play heavy minutes. It's an opportunity for them to get some fresher legs.
Last thing I wanted to ask you about, Austin, just in terms of Terry Moore and what has made her such a great leader of this Indiana program. Something I've kind of thought about as the Indiana men's basketball coaching search has gone on is just the hires of Terry Morin and Kurt Signetti and how they've obviously both worked out really well for Indiana. Obviously, different eras in terms of when they were hired. Terry Morin hired, I think 2014, I believe, that summer by Fred Glass, and then more recently, Kurt Signetti hired by Scott Dolson. But both have been obviously program changers for different reasons. From the Indiana women's basketball perspective, a program that really didn't have a lot of tradition, a lot of culture when she took over the job. But we sit here, almost 11 years later, and Indiana's going to the tournament every year. They're winning a lot of games. They may not be landing 5-star recruits and the highest profile recruits, but they bring in players, they develop them, they make them better. They maybe make their own stars in some ways. I'm curious from just being around Coach Moore and talking to her, watching how she's built her program, are there one or two things that maybe stand out that she's done that have really impressed you just in terms of being able to sustain this over such a long period of time? Because it's any coach can maybe have a year or two where they're really good and they ride a player who's maybe exceptional for a couple seasons and then that player goes away. But this has been a sustained period now over a long course of time, and to me that really is impressive.
Yeah, I think there's several things that go into it. I mean, number one, you mentioned they're not going to load up on 5-star top 50, top 20 recruits in the country. Although I think that the status of the program a couple years ago probably could have started to enter that conversation. But they're more concerned about how do you fit with us? They don't want it to ever be about the player. It needs to be about the team. It needs to be about the program. And so they try to make sure they get the right people in the program. And that, I think, has led to so much success here over the last 4 or 5 years, is that these locker rooms have really gelled. And these are players that really enjoy playing with each other, playing for IU. And I mean, one big thing is, like, if you ever talk to Coach Morin, and I'm fortunate enough to get to do it, whether it's pregame interviews, whether it's coaches shows, or whether it's just in the general ebbs and flows of traveling. She's such an intelligent basketball mind, and I learn something every time I do a coach's show with her, because she's not afraid to get into the nitty-gritty and really talk about her philosophy, her style, what she's trying to do offensively. Was pretty open and honest about how, like, at the 1-2 start to the year, like, something needed to change. And she got a phone call from Coach Glenn Box, who's now at Miami, and he was kind of telling her what he had seen on TV. He says he watches every game still, and they fixed it, and here they are back in the NCAA tournament. But she does such a good job of putting her players in the right position to succeed, and she has full buy-in and trust from these players. And there's a really, really solid relationship there between her and her players, a relationship when anybody comes back, you see how much they love her, love the program. And the development part of it is big. I mean, you think about, I mean, Tyra Buss was a great high school player, but what she turned into at Indiana, I don't think anybody could have seen that coming. Amanda Cahill, another showing of that. They went and got Brenna Wise in the transfer portal, and she was just a dynamite addition to that team when they went on that WNIT run and the Elite Eight run. And then you think about players like Grace Berger. She was a pretty highly touted player that Terry Moore was able to snag away from Louisville, and wasn't all that impactful her freshman year. Grace was on the bench, played a little bit, wasn't the Grace Berger that she eventually became. And obviously, Mackenzie Holmes is the ultimate look at what I did to this. But even somebody, if you look at somebody like Sarah Scalia, she comes into the program from a place at Minnesota where she played every minute, all the time, was kind of an ultimate green light, could do whatever she wanted on the floor. And they get her, and she comes to Bloomington, but they're like, hey, it's gonna be a lot different around here. Like, you're not just gonna go up and chuck threes. We're also gonna need you to come off the bench. And it took her a little bit to get used to that role. But did she transfer immediately after that season because she was frustrated with the new role? No, she stayed a second season and had an unbelievable final year of college basketball because of her relationship with this staff and the trust that she has in them. They made her a great defender. They made her a great ball handler. I mean, it was just a really, really impressive form of development. And we've seen that with a lot of players in their time at Indiana. And I think lastly, she has built a great staff around her and has great trust in the people around her. She's not afraid to delegate. And I know we talked about the last time we were on here about her journey to West Lafayette and learning from Matt Painter and how he delegates with PJ Thompson and how she's kind of doing that with Ali Papberg now. Rhett Wiersbe's always been right there as a really top-notch assistant coach along with her. So I think she's not afraid of trusting her staff to come up with a game plan that's going to be best fit for these players. They do a lot of great work with them behind the scenes. And it's just, there's a consistency factor year in and year out. You know what you're going to get from a Terry Moore and coach team. They're going to play hard. They're going to play together. They're going to play good defense. And look, this crop of players over the last 5 to 6 years has been so good with the fan base too. And I think that's a big part of where this program has grown, is the fan base. And I mean, we're losing a couple this year in Chloe and Sydney that have just epitomized what it's like to be a Hoosier, and the way they relate with these fans. They've become ginormous crowd favorites, and watching them interact with the fans after the game for a long time, signing autographs, saying hi, taking pictures. They do it. And that all comes from Coach Morin and the way she appreciates the fans. And she has made sure that these players appreciate the fan base. And so I think all of it, you mix it all together, it has created a program that has thrived and doesn't seem to be slowing down.
Yeah, I think a lot of lessons, particularly in what you talked about there late in terms of the players and the fan base and just the program connection, can be applied going forward. I think with the men's program, I think some of that's been lost in the last couple of years, and hopefully that'll be restored because I know just from talking to a lot of fans, they don't feel that connection. So I think that's a valuable thing. Anytime that a fan base can feel like they know the players and kind of all working together towards the same thing. I think it's a great thing. So Austin, thanks for sharing those thoughts and thank you for making the time to come on this week. Safe travels out to South Carolina and have a great call for the game. I know it's exciting, always exciting to be able to call an NCAA tournament game.
Absolutely. It's the best time of the year. Looking forward to it. And hopefully we can make some magic happen here.
Absolutely. Thanks everybody as always for listening to Podcast on the Brink. If you enjoy the show, please leave us a rating and a review over on Apple Podcasts. Leave us a 5-star rating over on Spotify, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.